On this episode of Six Queens, we are going to be talking about some subjects that listeners might find sensitive. Particularly, we are going to be talking a lot about human remains. So if you are squeamish, you might want to skip this episode. Just a warning. I'm Kate.
I'm Callie.
We're two friends who met in an early modern history MA,
Welcome to the Six Queens podcast.
where queenship reigns supreme. Welcome to this week's episode, which is the first Six Queens Halloween special. And this is something that I am very excited about because Halloween is my favorite holiday. So I'm really excited that we are honoring our queens in the spooky season.
I love that you come prepared with your hat, with your witch's hat.
Yeah, it's a real shame that you guys can't see my witch's hat due to the medium of audio, but yeah, I like
I
Halloween.
I feel sufficiently underdressed sitting here in my. Actually, tell a lie. I've got my glow-in-the-dark pajamas on, which have bats on. So
There you go. And we need to be suitably dressed because this is an episode that is going to be suitably spooky. We are talking about the final resting places of many of our queens, and not necessarily going to be talking about the ghost stories, but the graves themselves and the actual physical remains of our queens. A lot of them have really interesting and a little bit gory histories, so we thought this would be the perfect topic for our Halloween special.
I just can't talk about gore and graves and dismembered bodies when at Halloween. When can you? Just give it a go, see what happens.
We thought we would organize this in maybe a different way than usual, which, it works for us. We're going to first talk about three queens who died as queens, and their deaths occurred in our timeline, let's say, of the sort of official lineup of the queens. They died when Henry was around. And then in part two, we're going to be talking about three queens who died away from court and away from Henry, and whose graves kind of reflect that a little bit more.
I think the way we kind of set out to do our conversations and the way we kind of envisioned our podcast going is it's probably not surprising to those of you who have listened to since day number one, and for those of you who have, thank you very much. That getting away from that chronology, and I think by looking at their graves out of that set narrative helps us understand them a little bit more, and I think sheds a lot of light on them and their resting places, really. So shall we kick off then with Jane Seymour? Because, the middle's also a great place to start. Let's start there.
Jane Seymour, in terms of the lineup, I think has the most sort of, I don't know, least politically dramatic death. So it seems like a good place to start, something to ease us into all the other ones, which are a little bit.
Yeah, I think hers is very, very straightforward. And one that's definitely left probably one of the biggest imprints, besides the violent deaths that we'll cover a bit later, on the kind of historical imagination and how we understand her role as a wife of Henry VIII and as a queen. There's always that understanding that she was Henry's quote unquote one true love and like the love of his life, probably for the reason that she died giving birth to his one and only son, Edward. So I think it goes back to that earlier conversation that we were having, about utility as a wife and as a queen and what that means, really. She was the one that out and out did the, quote, best job at giving him what he wanted and needed the most in the world.
Jane's death, I think, was also the most, dare I say, conventional, just because she suffered the fate of so many other women of the period. Dying in childbirth was something that was always a risk when becoming pregnant. So many women, two of our queens died in childbirth. So I think in that sense, it wasn't a violent death. It wasn't, I don't know, politically tragic. It was just the queen dying in childbirth, which is sad and which really shook up Henry, don't get me wrong. But in terms of conventionality, like it was always a risk that they ran.
Jane, just for a little bit of context then, died on the 24th of October in 1537 and was only aged around 29. And she actually died down at Hampton Court Palace shortly after giving birth to Edward. And she's actually buried down at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. I think what makes her death potentially unconventional in the sense that it was the most conventional is that she actually receives a queen's funeral. She's buried in the vault at Windsor, and it's a bit of an odd one because she was never actually meant to be that was never meant to be her final resting place. She was actually meant to be buried in a tomb with Henry himself, but it still wasn't finished after his death in 1547. And while that work was meant to be carried on by his children, never actually happened. So Jane's final resting place was never her intended final resting place.
I think it's worth noting just because it's interesting, but also it's a little bit creepy for our episode, is that Jane is actually technically buried in two places, and it has to do with a process that we're going to be talking about a lot on today's episode. But it was a very common practice, and I think still might be, to embalm the bodies of the nobility. So this is something that they think helps preserve the body. They remove the organs, including the heart. So actually, according to legend, and I think a source in Letters and Papers, which is a big Tudor source, Jane's organs, all the stuff that they removed during the embalming process, were actually buried at Hampton Court in the Chapel Royal. So a lot of ghost stories at Hampton Court revolve around Jane Seymour's heart being buried under the chapel floor. But then she laid in state in the Chapel Royal, and then she was taken to Windsor for burial.
That idea of part of you being left potentially where you died, or at a chapel somewhere separate, it's very, I don't know, it's kind of like ceremonial organ donating in a way.
Another common theme we're going to be returning to many times in this episode is this idea of the Queen's graves being disturbed. And I think it's why we decided to do a whole episode about final resting places, because in a lot of senses, the queens weren't actually allowed to rest. And in Jane's case, her final resting place, it's the vault under the floor of St. George's Chapel, Windsor, is literally just a big hole under the floor. It's nothing special. And so it was opened several times to allow other coffins to be put in. So Jane's was the first, but then Henry joined her in 1547. And then actually, interestingly, it was also the holding place for King Charles I of England, who was beheaded during the English Civil War, and he joined her in 1649. And then another coffin that is in there with them is a really tiny coffin that historians believe belongs to one of the young children of Queen Anne and her husband, Prince George. Queen Anne tragically lost many or most all of her children. So they think that this coffin belongs to one of those children. But it just goes to show you that this was always supposed to be kind of a temporary thing. It's a holding place for all of these coffins, and Henry and Jane are just kind of there because this grand tomb that Henry envisioned for both of them never came to be. His children, I guess, did not want the expense and the burden of making that be.
Normally when you think about a monarch's death or things like that, you tend to think, big tombs, big like kind of epitaphs and things like that. And it's almost underwhelming, I think, when you then think about where they are and you're like, oh, really? And I think there's some kind of, I don't want to say delicious irony in it, but one of Henry VIII's like kind of big objectives in life was to outshine his father Henry VII, and then in death didn't quite manage it.
And especially when you know that the vault itself wasn't even really marked. Like, I think people had an idea that Henry and Jane were down there. Charles was a surprise, apparently, when they in the early 19th century, when they were doing some work on the church and they found people and Charles's coffin was there, and they're like, oh, that's where he ended up. Cool. But I think there was some idea that Henry and Jane were down there together, but it wasn't marked. Now, under the orders of King William IV in the 19th century, there is a marble slab on top of the vault, which has the names of Henry and Jane and King Charles I. So people know that it's there. And if you watch any of the royal weddings recently in the last few years that took place in St. George's Chapel, it's the aisle where they all walk up to the altar. It's right there. But yeah, as you were saying, for someone as big as Henry VIII, both physically and in our memory, it's just a slab in the ground, and it's certainly not what he envisioned for himself.
Bit underwhelming, really. And I think as well, for all the plans that he had for like what he wanted for Jane and her kind of final resting place to like to kind of honor her and what she did for him and the country, it's really underwhelming as well.
But I guess in the end, she does have the distinction of actually being beside Henry, and Henry decided that he did want to be with her, even in the sort of temporary holding space.
Yeah.
He wanted to be with her. So I think people have interpreted that pretty correctly over the years as, that's the ultimate mark of favor. Like, Jane appears in all these posthumous portraits and she's referred to as the favorite constantly. But the fact is that she's the one that Henry wanted to be buried with. She's the one who is buried with Henry now. So you can't really argue with that.
No, you really can't. I think that is absolutely right there. And as we kind of mentioned before, it goes a long way of preserving that historical imagining, even if we've still got those one-sided letters that survive between him and Anne, and he's got that idea of like turning our country upside down and things like that for her. Ultimately it's Jane. Ultimately she's who he wants in both life and death.
Moving on to things that aren't so lovely, the other two deaths that occurred sort of in our timeline when our queens were actually queens were the more traumatic ones. And we've talked about the deaths of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard in our previous episode about the Tower of London, but now we're going to be talking a little bit more specifically about what happened to their bodies and their physical remains inside the church in the Tower of London, which is St. Peter ad Vincula, St. Peter in Chains. And they had very similar sort of stories about what happened to their body, their remains. So we are just going to sort of tie them up together and look at them a little bit in similar circumstances. So starting with Anne. Anne, of course, died on May 19th, 1536. She was beheaded by sword at the Tower of London. And it's interesting that her death was almost so well planned, like to the point of, they sent for this special executioner, and the trial was basically decided for her, but they still went through the motions of it anyway, and all the men were executed. But nobody really thought about what happened to Anne after the head fell off the shoulders. When that happened, you kind of get the sense of people going like, oh, okay, it's over. But then the ladies who accompanied Anne to the scaffold are like, no, we still have this body to take care of. We still have to bury her and treat her with some respect after she's been killed. So there was no coffin actually prepared for Anne, and they had to find an old chest. It was a long chest that was used to store arrows in the armory, and so they put her in there with her head on her chest, and they wrapped her in a shroud, which was common, and they put her in the box, and they buried her underneath the high altar of the church inside the tower, where her brother George had just been interred a few days before. So the ground was ready and fresh, and that is where she was put. And a few years later, of course, the ground was disturbed again because her other sort of sister queen and cousin, Catherine Howard, was interred in basically the same place, a little ways away from Anne, underneath the high altar at St. Peter at Vincula. Catherine Howard was also executed on Tower Green. She died on February 13th, 1542, and she was interred there as well. I think they did a little bit more prep for her. She was buried in a nice coffin, I think. Well, not a nice one, probably. But the thing that marks them as being so similar is not only the exact place where they were buried, but they were given traitors' burials, meaning that their burial place sites were not marked. For a long time, they both rest next to each other in unmarked graves.
It paints a devastating picture about the world that they were living in and how disposable they were as people. And then, as I mentioned, once our heads are off their bodies, it's a case of out of sight, out of mind. There was nothing else to be said about them or for them. It's let's just forget about them and move on.
Especially considering that the graves went unmarked for so long. I mean, I think it was recorded that that's where they were, and that was the logical place to put them. They were buried in a church that was yards away from where they were actually executed. So it made sense that that's where they would be. but there was no stone in the pavement at all. They were just there, and then the floor tiles were put back over them. It was not supposed to be an honorable death. It was supposed to be humiliating in a way. I just think it's interesting that nothing was done sooner. I guess we'll get into what happened and what you can see today when you visit their graves. But like during the reign of Elizabeth, for example, there was nothing done to honor Anne in her place there. I guess because Elizabeth thought that it would be a little bit too risky to align herself with her mother, who was buried in an unmarked grave. But I just think it's interesting that it took 300-400 years for there to be any recognition there.
I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for her, someone who's quietly trying to figure out how they can relate to their mother and kind of hold on to a little part of them, and not having that place to go and mourn or anything like that must have been have a heartbreaking effect. And the idea that the recognition that came for them later, so for both Anne and Catherine, was actually really only accidental. So it was in 1876, during the reign of Queen Victoria, who ordered some work to be carried out on the chapel because it was falling into a bit of a state of disrepair, that workmen stumbled across Anne and Catherine when they were trying to, of all things, make the floor more even and kind of stabilize an uneven floor.
It is nice though when you read the account of the restoration of the church in the 1870s. They were all very respectful. Like I think they had an idea that they would find these human remains, so they were trying to be as respectful as possible. And so then when they started stumbling upon the remains, basically where they thought they would find them, they did their best to actually try to identify everybody and then rebury everybody with a little bit more honor and then mark them accordingly. So it wouldn't just be sort of a slapdash, like here are all the people we think are buried here. They did their best to try to assign names to the remains that they found. They did not find Catherine Howard, actually, in the place where they thought she would be buried. They did not find anyone. And all of the other remains that they thought were female at the time, they thought were a little bit too old to have been somebody like Catherine, who died when she was 18 or 19 years old. So, but they did find someone that they thought would be Anne. And the description is actually very fascinating. And it's probably a little bit colored by some historical hindsight, but they described her as a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, which checks out, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull, and that they bore witness to the queen's little neck. So a little bit of Victorian pathology for you all, but I just think it's interesting that, we're going to get into some stories about people not being as respectful and, people being a little bit just more interested in seeing the remains and getting close to the relics of these really interesting historical people. So it's nice to read that in this place, which has so often been associated with tragic, untimely death, that they were more respectful, and they gave them the burial that they thought that these people deserved.
I love that Victorian imagery of this one's got a little neck, therefore is Anne. By her own admission, she had a little neck.
Yeah, so like I said, colored by a little bit of historical hindsight, but the best they could do in 1876.
No, absolutely. And that's not to mock them at all. It's just I think it's brilliant. With this story in particular, the way that Anne and Catherine are handled so gently and so carefully and respectfully, while they had to wait a little bit of time to have that in their death, I think it's fitting that someone finally did that for those people, finally did that for them and cared for them.
Today, if you would like to go pay your respects to Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, you can. The church is open to visitors during parts of the day at the Tower of London. I don't think you can go up directly to the high altar and really get to see them up close, but you can see the relative area where they were buried. And yeah, like we said, they're marked now. They are not unmarked graves anymore. And actually, every May 19th, there is a bouquet of red roses left on Anne's grave to remember her. Catherine doesn't really get the same attention as Anne, unfortunately, even though they were victims of relatively the same consequence. And her remains weren't even identified during all of this restoration, but she does indeed have a marker, if not all of the same attention.
So now what we're going to do is we are going to have a look at our other three queens. So we're going to be taking a look at Catherine of Aragon, Catherine Parr, and Anne of Cleves. And these three, they didn't die as queens, which sets their kind of deaths and apart from the other three who we were just having a chat about. Much like the other three, then we'll just do a little bit of scene setting, and then we can jump into some juicy details that I know Kate's got brimming under her hat. So, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine died on the 7th of January, 1536, and she was only 49 when she died. So she actually died at Kimbolton Castle, quite a way outside of London, and I'll come back to that in a second. And she's buried at Peterborough Cathedral. With Catherine's death, there is, I think it's fair to say, a lot of humiliation and a lot of embarrassment that, goes hand in hand with how she died and where she died. So Catherine actually died in relative poverty and obscurity, I think is fair to say, by the end of her life, compared to her heyday as Queen of England. She was, forced out of London, forced away from the court and, life that she knew, and even forced away from her daughter, ultimately to stop her garnering any support for her marriage that she had with Henry, and any support that she had that, she was the one true Queen of England. Effectively, she was out of sight, out of mind. So Henry and Anne could get on with their marriage and they could start building Anne as the one true Queen of England, which for someone like Catherine of Aragon, literally died on a hill defending her claim that she was the Queen of England. So to then end her life, and it was even on her grave that, she was the Dowager Princess of Wales, not the Queen. It makes your blood boil, doesn't it?
Yeah, Catherine's death, I think more so than any others, is wrapped up in the most political controversy, just because there's so many rumors surrounding her death, and there's so many slights when it comes to her burial and her funeral. I mean, even when they were embalming her, as we said, this was something that was done, they opened her up and they saw that her heart actually was black. And today we interpret this as she probably suffered from some kind of cancer, but at the time it made for all sorts of rumors about how Catherine was actually poisoned by Henry or Anne or both, take your pick, who actually, there are some accounts of them actually celebrating Catherine's death. We don't know if they're true or not, but then, coupled with this idea of her being poisoned, it just makes for a really messy situation.
There's a good game of historical Cluedo in there somewhere by 16th century standards.
As Kelly said, Catherine just slight upon slight at this point. So she was buried not as the Queen of England, but as the Dowager Princess of Wales, and away from London, which Henry thought would be better because he wanted to make this a little bit more hush-hush. He thought that if she was buried in London, it would encourage lots of mourners to come, which would, be a slight on Anne Boleyn, who was queen at this point. So she was buried in a relatively modest tomb at Peterborough. She was buried near the high altar, which is a place of honor, but the tomb, again, was more befitting of a noble rather than an actual Queen of England. It was pretty modest, and we do have one description of it from a little bit later, which says that it was a low table monument raised on two shallow steps with simple quarterfoils carved in square set diamond wise. So a little bit of decoration. It was raised off the floor, but it wasn't great. And actually, there was an altar nearby. So later on, during like Elizabeth I's reign, when there was a little bit more anti-Catholic sentiment, it was a place where Catholics could go and pray. Some people have attributed miracles to this spot. So it ended up sort of going against what Henry wanted, and people did go there. But again, there was no glitz or gold about it. It was just kind of there.
Because that's what was expected, not because, there was any kind of, I suppose, love lost there or anything like that. But, that's too easy. That's too easy for poor Catherine, who actually had her tomb vandalised in April of 1643 by the troops of Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War. But as Kate was saying, there was an altar on it or nearby it, which made it a target. So, in a kind of like a swell of anti-Catholic sort of sentiment that was again gathering speed again in the 1600s, it was destroyed. By the time 1895 rolls around, finally we start to see a bit of good fortune for Catherine and her given the respect that she deserves. So on her tomb that the Catherines of England fundraised for, people paid a penny to raise. People paid a penny for a new installation to have her tomb restored, and brought back to its former glory. She's actually named as Catherine of Aragon on her tomb. It took a little while to get there, but we finally, she was finally gotten there, and she is in gold lettering. It says that she's Catherine, Queen of England.
I love too that the fundraising was the Catherines of England. Like everybody, I guess, named Catherine is supposed to feel some kind of pity for this woman and donate a penny to give her a proper burial. But hey, it worked, and now she is buried according to her true status, which is what she would want. Although, even though her burial is nice now, there are a couple stories of her grave actually being disturbed. And like little souvenirs being taken even, which is a little bit disturbing. And I don't like to think of these people who have suffered so much in life being exhumed by, especially the Victorians, for like thrill seeking almost. So Catherine's grave was disturbed twice. That has been recorded. The first time was actually a little bit more respectful. It was by researchers who wanted to validate or disprove the claim that Catherine's friend Maria de Salinas had actually been buried in the tomb with her. Maria was a loyal friend, and I guess there was a rumor for a really long time that they had been buried together. But alas, they opened the tomb and they saw one coffin there, which they decided was Catherine's. And then, they were nice and they left it alone. But later in the 1890s, the tomb was opened again around the time that the Catherines of England were fundraising for this, more impressive memorial for her. And they actually opened the coffin this time to see what they could find. And they saw Catherine's skeleton through the shroud. They didn't necessarily disturb it, but they still, they opened the coffin and they took a little bit of her shroud as a souvenir, which is just, I don't know. I don't get it.
Again, it's very Victorian, isn't it? There's that fascination with death and not poking it with a stick, but let's look at it for almost the sake of looking at it, really, isn't it? Curiosity getting the better of people. But what I do really love about Catherine's grave, and I think it's, again, somewhat contrary to what Henry wanted, it's not necessarily a shrine to her, but the fact that people will go and put pomegranates on it. Go back to that symbol of Catherine of Aragon, symbol of her as a queen. People will go and, pop a pomegranate down for her and, maybe take a picture with it or something. So again, not a shrine per se, but a point of gathering for people who have, for one reason or another, whether it's religious affiliations with her or kind of just historical, a love of her as a historical person. I think it's brilliant.
It is sad though. Like I'm glad that she has this nice tomb, and it's really lovely to think about people honoring her in the way that she definitely should be honored. But it's just sad when you think about all of the trauma that not only she went through in her last days, but then the people around her, the people who were loyal to her, like Maria de Salinas or like her daughter Mary, in seeing their friend and mother and loved one go through such a humiliation. And, Mary actually in her will had plans to move Catherine, and she wanted there to be a tomb constructed in Greenwich, I believe, for both of them together so that they could be together forever and that they could have a nice tomb, showing them as they should be remembered. But that did not happen. And Mary, which is a whole other can of worms, is now buried underneath Elizabeth I in Westminster Abbey. So both Catherine and Mary suffered that sort of slight after death of not being remembered the way that they should have for a very long time, and Mary still isn't.
I do feel for them. I feel for both. Actually, to be fair, I think there's an element of feeling for all 6 of these women, that we talk about with such fondness and such passion. I think really nothing ever really seems to go their bloody way, not for lack of trying. Let's be clear. Something always, there's always a turn up that throws them off course in a sense. And I don't know. Sorry, just general musings on the situation, really. But yeah, it's a struggle, I think, sometimes to try and reconcile that the fact of what happened to them, and that we can go and for the most part, you can go see them in one way or another, but remembering that they're people and that their fates weren't happy.
And Catherine, too, went through 20 years of marriage, sort of expecting that she would be the one buried with Henry. And when we talk about Henry planning this tomb for him and Jane, I think he was just generally planning a tomb for himself and his wife, much in the same way that his parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, are buried together in this beautiful joint tomb with effigies right next to each other. Henry actually hired that sculptor to do his tomb for him and his wife, who was Catherine. So the idea was that Catherine was the one who was going to be buried in this glorious joint tomb with Henry as his queen, and yet that became a completely different story. And now we're talking about Catherine's grave, where she's all by herself basically in Peterborough, which is miles away from anyone who was in her family or who she cared about. So yeah, it's just there's an element of sadness to all of these burials, not just because they were people who died, but because the burials themselves are not necessarily reflective of their lives and their status. But I think Catherine's is definitely one of the saddest in that way.
Kind of sticking with that theme of disturbed burials and disturbed sort of afterlives, I suppose, I think that brings us neatly on to Catherine Parr, who, much like Jane Seymour, died shortly after childbirth. And it's worth just remembering, she died a little bit after Henry VIII, so she actually died on the 5th of September 1548, and she was about 36 years old, and she was actually married to Thomas Seymour at this point, the brother of Jane Seymour. So she actually, we spoke about them a little bit last week and about their time together at Chelsea Palace. But that's not where she actually died. She died at Sudley, Thomas's country estate, and is buried at the chapel at Sudley Castle. Much like the others, she had a relative period of peace, and she actually laid in peace for about 200 years, which, it's nice. But again, much like Catherine, she was no stranger to the English Civil War. And the castle itself, I should say, at Sudley was actually destroyed during the Civil War because it was a base for a royalist base.
So after Sudley fell into ruins, Catherine had a little while where she could rest in peace, but the ruins became sort of a local, exotic place to travel. A lot of people would want to travel to the ruins because they looked romantic, or else they were, again, thrill seekers. They were hunting for this sort of lost Tudor queen. So Catherine's body actually has quite a history after she was interred. Catherine, like the others, was embalmed, and we know from various accounts of her being exhumed, sadly, over the years, that she was particularly well embalmed because the state of preservation seems to just be amazing. And Catherine, throughout the late 1700s and a little bit into the 19th century as well, Catherine's grave was exhumed at least 10 times that I've been able to find. And it was because people were curious about her in much the same way that I guess people were curious about Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard. People were really wanted to get close to a famous historical figure. So the first time she was exhumed, it was actually by two women who had come to the chapel in search for her, who actually hired somebody to do the digging for them. Agnes Strickland, the Victorian historian, she recounts this in her book. But the thing that stuck with them most, once that they had brought up the coffin and cut through the lead that enclosed Catherine's body, was that Catherine's eyes were in a perfect state of preservation. Like, they saw Catherine Parr's eyes, which just, I don't know. That's again, I don't get it.
Well, that's going to stick with me for a while. Just for those of
Yeah.
you out there who are interested in history and in the embalming process, please don't use this as an excuse to go around and digging up people. That we're not advocating for that in the slightest.
Happy Halloween. But the fun does not stop because, like I said, there were a lot more times. The main offender, whose name comes up quite a bit in the saga, is a man named John Lucas who lived nearby. I think he was a cleric. And in 1782, he also went in search of Catherine's coffin and again exhumed it and brought up the coffin. It had already been disturbed in some way, he said, but he went on and he disturbed it further. I think he was looking for, I guess, confirmation that this was indeed Catherine Parr. And they actually cut through the shroud, not all of it, but only a little bit over her arm. And he said that the skin was still, quote, white and moist.
I'm a fervent believer that you never use that word anyway. That is not a word that moist should never be used, let alone when you're poking around somebody's body.
Yeah.
Oh, there's something to be said for morbid curiosity, but again, stop poking the dead people.
John Lucas was also the one who started this trend, apparently, of taking little bits of Catherine to have as a souvenir. So, like Catherine of Aragon, where they took a little bit of her shroud. In this case, they were actually taking little bits of Catherine. So, John Lucas took a lock of her hair, but then in subsequent exhumations by other weird tourists, I guess, they took little things like her teeth. So actually at the museum at Suitably Castle today, you can see all these little bits of Catherine Parr's corpse that were taken by people over the years. But it's interesting, in all of the subsequent exhumations, which happened in the 1780s and the 1790s and then into 1800, she becomes more decomposed, I guess. Like, the embalming process becomes a little bit less effective because she's being exposed to air so often. So every description that we have of an exhumation, which are many, unfortunately, she becomes a little bit freakier.
I think being constantly subjected to having bits of you chipped off will do that to a person.
The story that I found the weirdest was that the locals apparently were very much aware that this was happening, and it was sort of a local lore story of like, hey, there's a dead queen in this ruined chapel, let's go to have a look. So in the summer of 1782, they rounded up a little group, and the idea was that they were going to go find Catherine, but they were going to reinter her to prevent all of this stuff from happening anymore. But unfortunately, they had dinner before, and they all got really drunk. So by the time they made it to Catherine and they exhumed her, nobody was really interested in reburying her with honor. They all, again, they took stuff. They took linen from her shroud. They took her hair. They took her teeth. Poor Catherine.
The poor woman.
A comforting word to everybody. This is the most gruesome story that we have on today's episode. So after this, it actually de-escalates very quickly. We'll finish up with Catherine, but just a word that this is about as graphic as it gets.
I mean, to be fair, it's pretty graphic. It sounds like something from a movie, but
I would watch that horror movie, though. Like, Catherine Parr comes back to haunt all these people who steal her teeth. I would watch that.
oh no, oh dear, I'm not about that one. She just goes around collecting. Like, how would that look? She just goes around collecting them and putting them back in, or
it's like, you know how in Pirates of the Caribbean, when all of the pirates are cursed because they took the gold out of the chest, it's like that, but Catherine Parr haunts them until she has all of her teeth back.
Oh, I'd be there for that. That's fun. Less horror movie than I was expecting. I think as far as graphic goes, in terms of bodies being exhumed and things like that, pretty up there. Again, and I think kind of partly what it goes back to is that we tend to see these people as characters and, forget that they're people, which I think is very much kind of what goes on with Catherine Parr. There's that idea with as you were mentioning, the locals, like, guess who's over there? Guess who's buried there? It's a queen. And I suppose in a sense it ties in with that idea of the myth of monarchy and things like that, and people wanting a piece of a king or a queen. Because, if you said, oh, it's Bob from down the road, the fascination disappears.
The good news is that, very much like Catherine of Aragon, Catherine Parr is okay now. That seems to be the moral of the story, is that, people mess with these graves for hundreds of years, but now in modern day, you can go visit and pay your respects properly. Please do not exhume Catherine ever again. Around the time that the weird party happened where they were going to rebury her but didn't, the same man who seemed to have started all of this actually thought, yeah, this has been getting out of hand, and he buried her in a different place so that people wouldn't be able to find her anymore. And then when Suitably, the estate, was brought under new ownership, they found her again, and they hid her again, but in a more respectful way, so that when they restored the chapel in the 1860s, they moved her into the resting place she has now, which is a much more appropriate tomb. It has a really beautiful marble effigy on top, and as I said, you can go visit it today and pay your respects.
I suppose all's well that ends well in that case for her, but that's a lot. That's a lot going on.
It brings us on to the last queen, who we decided to end with just because after this particularly sensational story, it is a little bit more comforting that when Anne of Cleves died, she was actually interred in Westminster Abbey in a place of honor. So as we said last week, when Anne of Cleves died, it was in London in 1557. She was about 42 years old, and her stepdaughter and her friend Mary the First thought so highly of her that she insisted that Anne be buried at Westminster Abbey, quite close to the shrine of Edward the Confessor and the medieval kings and queens who are all buried at Westminster Abbey. And her tomb is right on the high altar. So actually, if you're a tourist today, you can't get up close to it. You can see the back of it, which has a little epitaph labeling it as the grave of Anne of Cleves, the Queen of England. But the tomb itself is actually a very nice tomb right off the high altar. You can see it if you go to the museum and look down from above. But it's carved with Anne's initials and her carbuncle badge, crowns and English lions, a lot of symbols of royalty, and then a couple skulls as well, some memento mori. So actually, the most queenly of our burials, I would think, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. That is very much thanks to Mary having her buried at Westminster Abbey. I think it's a sure and far way of preventing skin being picked off, royalists coming and disturbing you or ending up in an unmarked grave or anything like that. I just think it's so fitting for Anne of Cleves' quote-unquote afterlife. She was really living her best life after her divorce. It's very fitting for her, and I only wish that our other ladies could have had the same end. Knowing that at least one of them has is somewhat comforting.
Yeah, on the list of notes I made when I was researching for this episode, I noticed that Anne's is a bit stubby compared to the other ones. I mean, like, I have a whole page on the shenanigans with Catherine Parr, and a whole page on the political implications of Catherine of Aragon, and all the exhumations of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard. And yet, where Anne is concerned, it's literally just she was buried in a nice place in Westminster Abbey. The end. And it really is the end because, like you said, it's in Westminster Abbey. No one's going to open up the tomb. There's no risk of anything happening. So Anne, in that sense, is boring for us because it's not really a story that we can tell like the other ones. But that's what you want.
It really is. By any kind of stretch of the imagination, especially by 16th century standards. She had a nice life. She had a nice death.
I mean, if we can imagine them having some sort of like council in the afterlife, and everyone's like, so how are you down on Earth? Like, how are you? And Anne is really the only one who's like, yeah, no one's seen me since I went in there. It's all good.
I'm just having a nice time. I'm just here. I mean, if we're honest, if they were all this unremarkable, we wouldn't have an episode and we'd be talking about something else today. I think it's just very important that we're able to bring these conversations to the forefront and kind of have them and look at them really, because, as we were saying at the start, that they're never really part of the conversation.
Yeah, it's not even researching it. It's hard to find anything about it other than where they were buried when actually the story continues so much. And with the exception of Catherine Parr, that's a little bit more Halloween-y. But with all the other ones, what happened to their physical remains does have so much implications for their stories. Jane Seymour being left in a tomb with Henry VIII, awaiting the construction of a grander tomb that would never become, or Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn being in unmarked graves until relatively recently. Catherine of Aragon, again, only relatively recently being honored the way that she should. The story continues on. So I'm glad that we have this episode because we can talk about it. But as you said, we shouldn't have to. They should all be like Anne of Cleves, right?
There is a serious side of this, and like you said, their legacies are being continued and they are evolving, and I think it prompts an interesting conversation about what that will look like in the future and kind of how they evolve next.
Thinking about your own experiences, how many have you been to? Because I've been to, I guess I've seen Jane Seymour and I've seen Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard's and I've seen Anne of Cleves. From the four I have seen, there is a great sense of tranquility when you go there. Like they are finally at peace in some way. And even when you know the story of how they got there and all the crap that they had to endure, even and how they were buried, there is a nice sort of sense of reverence when you go, even if you're not necessarily leaving anything, you're just visiting them.
I remember the first time I went to see Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn. I was actually very lucky. I was at the Tower of London on a very quiet day, so there wasn't anybody else really apart from me and the one of the Beefeaters actually in the chapel, and I kind of got to just stand there and kind of look at them. Having that point where you can go and visit them and be within touching distance of them is quite a powerful thing.
In contrast to the stories we have of all the people who, wanted to literally physically be close to these people, not just standing in front of their graves or above their graves, but actually exhuming them and getting a piece of their shroud or their hair or whatever. It's nice to know that we have this reverence when we go, where we want them to be undisturbed. We want to show our respects and we want to feel that closeness, that proximity, but not necessarily at the expense of their honor, let's say.
No, definitely won't be wearing them as a skin suit as a Halloween outfit this weekend. I'm going to say that. To me, that's uncomfortable.
It's also interesting, though, because the topic of exhumation is sort of topical right now in the historical community, especially following the rediscovery of the remains of King Richard III in 2013. And won't get into that, but
No. Different story, different day.
but it's interesting how now, because of all of the research that's come from the physical remains of Richard III, like we have a modern DNA profile for him now, for example. It's interesting to see historians postulating about like what would happen if we dug up Henry VIII and we tested him, or what would happen if we actually exhumed Catherine of Aragon to see if she really did die of cancer or poison. It's just those debates are coming back around, which I find interesting.
It's something I struggle with, I think, because where does one's curiosity about these people and how they died and things like that end, and where does respect for the individual start, or, vice versa? I don't know. I think it's interesting, and when people have done this research and things like that, I always find the results incredibly interesting, and just very much that give me more, but I'm always very torn. I don't know how do you feel about that?
I would agree. I think there's a fine line between wanting to know as much as we can about these people and just letting them be dead. It to me, a lot of the stories we've told about the exhumations of the queens did start with good intentions of like, let's find out how many people are actually buried here, or the floor's uneven, so let's make sure that we restore this chapel, and in the process we can bury these people with honor. That's great, but at some point you gotta just let them rest. And doing this again, I don't necessarily know if it would tell us anything anyway, because in the case of many of these queens, they probably have very little remains left. I mean, Catherine Parr, by the last time they had opened up her coffin, was already mostly decomposed. So I don't know what would be left anyway. So it's interesting and it's tempting. It's really tempting to be able to solve all these mysteries. But at some point, we just got to let them go. So it was fun to go through all these stories, though, and give it a little bit of a spooky twist for Halloween. But as always, as the people who study these queens, and we love them and we admire them in our own ways. You have to show the respect for them in the end, and just squirm a bit when you think of all of the things that they've had to go through, even after they were technically done.
Go to sleep and dream of gooey eyes and moist white skin.
And stay tuned for the film that Callie and I are now going to be co-writing about Catherine Parr haunting all of these awful people who disturbed her rest.
The Revenge of Catherine Parr.
I love it. It's all I want now. So if we don't get to it, I really hope somebody who's listening to this will first, because that's less work for me.
Actually, surprise plot twist, no more podcast. We're writing a movie now.
Send us a tweet if you want to get on board. We're recruiting. Happy Halloween, guys. Thanks for sticking with us and listening to our bad movie pitches.
Thank you so much for listening to this series of 6 Queens. We'll be back after Christmas with a whole new series for you guys to listen to. So make sure you continue to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And make sure to tune into our holiday special in December. Also wanted to say thank you to everybody who has made doing these first 2 seasons such a success. So for all of you who have subscribed, who have listened to our drive runs, thank you ever so much. And a massive shout out to all of our friends who have helped us design our websites, design our logos, and just stuck with us and supported us. It really does mean a lot. So we'll see you in the new year.
Bye. Thank you.